On a stormy night in San Francisco, a powerful man sees something that stops him cold. A barefoot boy no older than 6, running from danger with terror in his eyes. Richard Miles, a billionaire who's spent years avoiding the world, opens his car door. And with that simple act, everything changes. The boy Lucas is silent, soaked, clutching a small wooden box. What begins as one night of protection turns into a journey filled with secrets, danger, and a bond that neither of them expected. But when the boy whispers, "They took my mom," Richard realizes this isn't just about saving a child, it's about saving himself. Stay with us. What happens next will test the limits of loyalty, justice, and chosen love. Richard Miles had been driving through San Francisco like a ghost. One hand resting on the steering wheel, the other gripping the edge of his coat collar against the draft from the vent. He wasn't supposed to be here at this hour. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere, really. Nights like this, he usually stayed in his penthouse, letting the city thrum beneath him while he stared at ledgers he no longer cared about. But the insomnia had driven him out. He told himself he was going to the 24-hour pharmacy for aspirin, but really he was running from silence. That's when it happened. Something darted into the road ahead, small and fast, barely a blur against the shine of wet asphalt. At first, Richard thought it was a stray animal. Then his headlights cut through the rain and he saw a boy no more than 6 sprinting barefoot, his feet smacking the pavement so hard it made Richard flinch. His shirt was torn, his hair plastered to his head, and behind him, 3 men surged forward like shadows that had learned to run. Richard's foot slammed on the brake, tires screeched, his heart slammed harder. It wasn't a decision. It was instinct, old and buried but still there. He leaned forward over the wheel, eyes narrowing as the boy stumbled and caught himself. The kid's thin arms pumped like they belonged to someone older, someone who'd had to run before. One of the men shouted something Richard couldn't make out. Their movements weren't random. They were deliberate, practice, the way people move when they've done this more than once. Richard's brain fired through possibilities: custody dispute, gang initiation, something darker, but none of them mattered. He'd spent years in boardrooms reading lies in men's eyes before they opened their mouths. He knew danger when he saw it. The boy's face turned slightly toward him, just long enough for Richard to see eyes wide with fear and something worse: resignation. He reached for the door handle before he knew he was moving. The seatbelt snapped as he twisted, throwing open the passenger door so hard it banged against its hinge. "Get in the car," he shouted, voice sharp, cutting through the rain. The kid skidded to the edge of the curb but didn't climb in. He hovered, breathing hard, fists clenched as if he was ready to swing at anyone who came close. "Hey," Richard called again, lowering his voice but sharpening it with urgency. "Kid, in the car. Now." The boy flinched at the sound, as if the word kid was both foreign and familiar. His chest rose and fell too quickly, like he couldn't get enough air. Richard's palm was still up, his fingers curled slightly. Not a demand, but an offering. Behind him, the men closed in, splashing through puddles, their shoulders squared and jaws set. "Stay out of this," one of them bellowed. "He's not yours." That phrase, "not yours," hit Richard like a hook to the ribs. He didn't know the boy, but in that moment, the thought of handing him back to those men felt impossible. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. His mind snapped back to another time, another night, his wife's hand slipping from his in a hospital bed. He had been too late then. He wasn't going to be too late now. "Now!" he barked, louder than before, the command echoing out of some place inside him he thought had gone dead years ago. The boy's eyes flicked between the open door and the men. His lips parted, but no sound came. He looked at Richard like people look at doors in burning buildings, unsure if they're exits or traps. One of the men reached out, fingers splayed as if he could grab the boy's shadow. "Don't do it," the man yelled, but his voice was already fading under the thrum of Richard's pulse. Richard leaned across the seat, stretching one arm toward the boy without crossing the line between invitation and force. "You're safe here," he said, quieter now, but with a conviction that made the words heavier than a shout. The boy blinked rain from his lashes. His knuckles were scraped, his knees bleeding from a fall he'd taken somewhere behind them. He shifted his weight, one foot stepping forward and then back like a skittish animal. Richard didn't move. He just held his hand out and let the silence between them decide. The men were closer now. Richard could hear their breath, harsh and eager. But he didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the boy. "You have to choose," he said under his breath. Not sure if he was talking to the kid or himself. The boy's shoulders trembled. He glanced at the men once more, then at the open door, at Richard's hand, at the dry warmth inside the car. Something flickered in his face. Not trust exactly, but the memory of it. His small fingers tightened on the strap of a wooden box slung over his shoulder. It was the only thing he carried. "Please," Richard said, "not as a plea, but as a promise." His voice cracked on the edge of the word. The boy stared at him for a heartbeat longer, his eyes searching for the catch, for the lie. And then in that instant, two worlds locked together on a strip of wet pavement, a man who had lost everything and a boy about to lose what remained. Lucas Carter hesitated at the threshold, rain running off his chin like tears. He wasn't letting himself cry. The men behind him were almost on top of him now, their boots slapping closer, but in that second he didn't look at them. He looked at Richard, at the stranger's face lit by dashboard glow, at the outstretched hand that wasn't grabbing, just waiting. There was no speech between them, only a long, raw exchange in which one person offered refuge and the other tried to believe it existed. Lucas's foot edged toward the car. His knuckles went white around the strap of his box. His breathing hitched. And then his eyes met Richard's again, and what he saw there, not pity, not power, but resolve, was enough to hold him still, poised on the edge of decision. A boy on the brink of running, and a man on the brink of stepping back into life. The car ride to Montgomery Tower was wordless. Richard didn't try to speak, and the boy beside him didn't so much as shift in his seat. Lucas sat with the soaked seatbelt across his narrow chest, his knees pulled close, arms wrapped protectively around a small wooden box that looked older than him. The box was scuffed at the corners, dark from years of handling, and Lucas held it with both reverence and desperation, not like a possession, but like a memory he couldn't afford to lose. Richard glanced at him now and then, but didn't ask questions. He knew better. He knew silence when it wasn't just fear but preservation, so instead he drove through the city like he was carrying glass. His usual sharp movements gentler, even in how he gripped the wheel. At the red lights, he caught himself watching the boy's reflection in the window instead of the road. There was something haunting about how still Lucas remained, even as his hair dripped and his teeth chattered. Richard didn't offer a towel. He didn't reach for the heater. He sensed that any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile thing had formed in the moment the boy chose to get in his car. The building's valet didn't ask questions either. Richard's presence often quieted people, his reputation, his wealth, his general unwillingness to explain himself. When the doorman opened the lobby door, his eyes briefly flicked to the child walking beside Richard, soaking wet and clutching that box like a lifeline. But no words were spoken. Lucas walked with small, fast steps, not because he was in a hurry, but because his muscles hadn't yet accepted that he was safe. Richard led the way into the private elevator, sliding his keycard with a practiced flick of the wrist, and they stepped into the mirrored space together. The doors closed with a whisper. Then, silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind between two people who don't need to speak. It was dense, charged, almost physical. Richard stood on one side, hands in his pockets, watching the numbers rise. Lucas stood on the other, shoulders hunched forward like he expected a slap, or worse, to be told to leave. The only sound in the cabin was the soft creak of wet shoes and the near-silent clicking of Lucas's fingernails tapping against the box. Richard didn't interrupt it. He couldn't explain why, but he felt that if he asked the boy to stop, something vital might come undone. In that strange vertical journey, 35 floors of silence, Richard found his thoughts pulled into unfamiliar territory. He hadn't had a child in his home since his nephew visited 6 years ago. That visit had lasted half an hour. He had no children of his own. His late wife, Emily, had wanted one. They'd spoken about it only twice, the second time being just days before her diagnosis. Now, standing beside this boy, not more than 40 pounds of soaked silence and guarded fear. Something stirred in him that had long gone quiet. He wasn't being noble. He didn't even know if he was being wise, but there was something in the boy's posture, in how tightly he held the box, that made Richard think of people who've lost too much and still fight to keep the last piece. He recognized that instinct. He'd lived it, and yet he didn't say a word. He didn't ask where the boy had come from or why those men had chased him. He didn't ask what was in the box or why. Lucas kept glancing at the panel of elevator buttons like he expected the floor to disappear. Instead, he stood beside him in the silence, not to demand answers, but to prove he wouldn't leave. The elevator chimed at the 35th floor. Lucas flinched. Richard did not. The doors opened into the private vestibule of his penthouse, a place most people only saw in glossy magazines. Sleek marble floors, a minimalist bench, curated modern art. But now it felt wrong. The air inside wasn't warm enough to chase away the boy's shivers. The walls weren't soft enough to absorb his tension. It felt, to Richard, like he had brought a war survivor into a showroom. He motioned gently for Lucas to step out first. The boy hesitated but obeyed, his shoes leaving faint dark prints behind him. Richard followed without speaking. Each step they took into the open space seemed to echo, but it wasn't sound, it was the weight of contrast. The child didn't belong here. Not in the way society defines belonging. Yet Richard couldn't picture anyone else here at this moment. He found himself thinking, absurdly, that he should remove the glass sculptures from the hallway. They looked like threats. Everything suddenly felt like a threat. The chairs, the corners, the high ceilings, all too cold to receive someone so breakable. Lucas stopped at the edge of the living room rug and didn't move further. He didn't look impressed by the view of the bay or the massive sectional sofa, or the grand piano that hadn't been played since Emily died. He just stood there, holding the box tighter, eyes darting around like someone waiting for permission that never came. Richard watched him from behind, and something inside him pulled taut. He didn't know what to say. He had no script for this. But he didn't want the boy to feel like a guest. That idea felt wrong. So he stepped to the side, walked toward the coat closet, and pulled out a thick blanket. "You can sit wherever you like," he said quietly, unfolding it over the arm of the couch. No response. Lucas didn't sit. He didn't speak. He just kept standing there, as if moving might cost him something else he couldn't afford to lose. Richard exhaled and let him be. It would take more than one ride and one sentence to unwind whatever this boy carried. And as Richard stood there watching a silent, soaking wet 6-year-old boy cradle a wooden box in the middle of his multi-million-dollar living room, something shifted. He realized the apartment had never felt large until now. Until this moment, it had been a refuge from grief. A place to disappear into numbers and screens and noise-canceling silence. But now it felt cavernous. Not because of the marble or the glass, but because of the smallness of the boy, the enormity of what he wasn't saying. The walls didn't echo with emptiness anymore. They echoed with possibility, with the weight of whatever Lucas brought with him and whatever Richard might now have to face. And still not a single word passed between them. Just the space. Just the silence. But it was a silence that held something different now. Not vacancy, not fear, but the fragile beginning of something neither of them could yet name. A silence full of invisible promises. And as Lucas continued to stand there, clutching the last remnant of his world, and Richard stood a few feet away, realizing his own was about to change, both remained wordless, but somehow no longer alone. Richard had barely turned from the hallway when Ellen, his longtime housekeeper, emerged from the guest bathroom carrying a bundle of damp clothes. She didn't say anything at first, her eyes scanning his face for clues, her mouth pressed into a line that had seen too many oddities over the years, but nothing quite like this. "He's cleaned up. Quiet as a statue," she finally said, setting the bundle on the marble island. Didn't flinch when I undid the laces on his shirt, just held onto that box like it was glued to his chest, wouldn't let me take it even when his fingers were purple. Richard gave a slow nod, his eyes drifting toward the living room where Lucas now sat on the farthest end of the sofa, wrapped in a navy blanket that dwarfed his frame. He looked small, smaller than in the elevator, smaller than any child should ever look. In his lap, the wooden box rested like a secret no one had earned the right to open. Richard hesitated. He had no authority, no invitation, but something in the boy's posture, the way he gripped the edge without trying to hide it, made him feel like maybe he was being asked to look. He approached carefully, not wanting to trigger the same flinch he'd seen before. Lucas didn't look up, but he didn't pull the box away either. That was enough. Richard lowered himself onto the other end of the couch, far enough to give space, close enough to feel the tension humming in the air between them. He rested his hands on his knees and spoke softly. "May I?" No answer. Lucas's fingers didn't move. Richard waited. Then, almost imperceptibly, the boy slid the box forward an inch. Permission, not surrender. Richard reached out and undid the simple latch. The wood creaked. Inside, on top of a few folded papers and an old cloth bracelet, lay a photograph. A single image worn at the edges, slightly curled, water-stained but intact. A woman, young and smiling, knelt beside a small boy on a picnic blanket. The boy, unmistakably Lucas, wore the same eyes, the same wary expression muted under a rare smile. Richard stared at it for a long time. "She's your mom?" he asked gently. Lucas finally looked up. Their eyes met, and the boy gave the smallest nod before his lips parted. "They took her," Lucas whispered. Just those 3 words. Nothing more. The weight of those words didn't land gently. They crashed, not just on the boy's small frame, but deep into Richard's chest like a bell rung in a hollow cathedral. It wasn't just the tragedy of a missing mother. It was the tone. That cracked, barely, their whisper that sounded like something already broken. Richard held the photo more carefully now, as if it might crumble under the pressure of memory. Who? He asked, though the boy was already retreating inward again, his shoulders tensing, his eyes dropping. Still, Lucas whispered again, as if the name itself carried poison. Men. They came to the shelter at night. Richard's breath hitched. He didn't ask more. He didn't need the details to know what that meant. What kind of men entered shelters at night? He had read those stories in the papers, brushed them off like they belonged in someone else's world. But now that world had a name, a face, a box, a photo, and a boy sitting quietly on his sofa, clutching silence like it was the only thing that couldn't be stolen from him. Richard's hands trembled as he set the picture back down and closed the lid of the box. Ellen stepped back into the room just then, drying her hands on a towel, eyes bouncing between the two of them. "I'll make some tea," she said gently, sensing the change in temperature. Not in the room, but between them. Richard gave a tight nod, still not taking his eyes off Lucas. He wasn't sure what he was seeing now. Not just a boy in need of protection, not just a child who'd survived something unspeakable, but a mirror, a tiny, shaking reflection of everything he hadn't dared revisit since Emily died. The helplessness, the rage, the inability to fix what had already been taken. When his wife passed, there had been no one to blame, no one to punish. But for Lucas, there was someone, or many someones, and that made the silence harder. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I'm sorry," he said. Not because it would help, not because it could undo anything, but because someone needed to say it, and he didn't think anyone had. Lucas didn't respond. He just stared at the box like it was the only truth he had left. The silence returned, but it had changed shape. It wasn't distant now. It wasn't filled with the awkwardness of strangers or the hesitation of fear. It was heavier, yes, but shared. A silence between two people who had both been shattered by different storms, but now sat in the same wreckage. Richard wanted to say more, to ask what shelter, to demand names, to offer vengeance, but he stayed still. Lucas had offered one truth tonight, one precious, bruised truth, and that was more than he had any right to expect. He looked at the boy again and saw it, not a victim, but someone trying not to vanish. The box, the photo, the whisper, all of it was Lucas's way of fighting to stay real. Richard had to respect that, so he leaned back slowly, exhaling a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He didn't move closer. He didn't reach out. He simply remained. Present. Anchored. Watching over this boy who hadn't cried, hadn't begged, hadn't broken, and yet somehow had said more in one whisper than most people managed in a lifetime. And as Lucas pulled the box back into his lap, sliding the latch closed with the care of someone sealing a wound, Richard watched him with something that felt dangerously close to reverence. The boy said nothing more. He didn't look at Richard again, but his fingers brushed the lid once, twice, then stilled. The silence returned to the room like a blanket, not suffocating, not empty, just full of things unspoken, of pain unmeasured, of a fragile thread being tied between two broken pasts. Lucas hugged the box to his chest again, curling slightly into the couch. Richard didn't move. He couldn't. He knew instinctively that this moment had changed something permanent. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just like that. A whisper, a photo, a truth laid bare. The boy had spoken. The photo had been shown. The words they took her hung in the room like a vow. And Richard, who had long stopped believing in vows, now carried that one too. Not yet in words, but already in weight. Richard didn't hesitate long. Once Lucas fell into an uneasy nap on the couch, arms still around that wooden box like an anchor, Richard stepped into his study, grabbed the phone from its cradle, and punched in a number he hadn't used in over 4 years. It rang once, twice, then picked up with the kind of silence that says, "You've reached someone who doesn't trust easily anymore." "Briggs," said the voice, low, measured, unchanged. Richard closed his eyes for half a second. "It's me," he said. "Richard Miles." A pause. Then the crack of movement on the other end, like someone sitting upright after a long time. "Well, hell," Briggs muttered. "Didn't think I'd hear your voice again unless it was in a eulogy." Richard didn't humor the sarcasm. "I need you." A boy showed up. His mother's missing. Taken. Possibly by the kind of people you and I used to lose sleep over. That silenced whatever joke Briggs had been preparing next. "You calling this personal?" he finally asked. Richard looked through the glass into the living room. where Lucas had shifted in his sleep, the edge of the photo peeking from the box. "Yeah," Richard said. "It's personal." By the time the second call ended, this one to Claire Monroe, who hadn't forgiven Richard for walking away from their last case, but hadn't hesitated to say she was in. Something had already shifted in him. He wasn't thinking like a businessman anymore. Not like a philanthropist either. He was thinking like someone with skin in the game, the kind of man who'd been powerless once and refused to feel it again. When Claire asked how serious it was, Richard had replied, "Enough to tear open every file I ever buried." And he meant it. After the calls, he walked through the apartment slowly, cataloging what could be used, what needed to be erased, and what had to be built. His sleek, sterile office, once designed to impress and intimidate, was stripped of all pretense within the hour. The black glass desk was soon cluttered with printed maps, red markers, old case files from favors he hadn't yet repaid. He retrieved boxes from storage, old tech, burner phones, encrypted hard drives. A Rolodex of names he swore he'd never contact again. "We find her," he'd said to Claire on the call. "No press, no badges, just results." She hadn't even blinked. "Good," she said, "because we're already late." Lucas watched him, not openly, not intrusively, but carefully. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He just moved from room to room when Richard did, silent as a shadow. His steps made no sound, but Richard could feel him, in the doorway, behind the couch, across the kitchen island. The boy didn't trust the quiet yet, but he seemed to trust movement, activity. He'd glance at the maps but wouldn't look at the names. He saw the photos but kept his eyes away from the screens. Richard, for his part, said little. He didn't want to interrogate him, not after what had already been spoken, that one broken phrase, "They took her." But he noticed the boy paying attention, every red circle on the map, every name scrawled in black ink, every note Richard murmured to himself. And he understood that this child wasn't just watching a rescue unfold, he was calculating, evaluating whether this man, this stranger, would actually do what he said he would. Richard didn't try to impress him. He just kept working, letting the boy watch without explanation, because some trust doesn't come through words. Some trust comes from showing up and not leaving. The transformation of the penthouse happened quickly. Richard was methodical when he wanted to be. Years of running companies taught him how to mobilize assets in under a day. But this wasn't about wealth. This was about leverage, instinct, and urgency. The once pristine dining table was now a mission board, photos pinned to cork, strings connecting locations, names scribbled under surveillance stills. Ellen, perceptive as ever, brought meals that went uneaten and never asked who the new contacts were in the building's guest log. Richard scribbled addresses, memorized gang territories in the Bay Area, cross-referenced news clippings with past intel. He hadn't touched this part of himself in a long time, the part that had once helped him finance silent operations, that had traced money through dark corners of Silicon Valley to places no press ever reached. Claire called twice more. Briggs sent over 2 encrypted files with facial recognition matches tied to the shelter's vicinity. One of the matches made Richard's blood freeze. Vince Rago, a name that reeked of unfinished business and buried threats. Richard circled it twice, hard enough to tear the paper. Lucas saw it. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. But that night, as Richard sat surrounded by files, red ink smudged on his fingertips, Lucas finally crossed the room. He stood at the edge of the map-covered table, stared at the photo of Rago for a long time, then pointed at it. "Him," he said, "just that." His voice barely carried across the space, but the room shifted. Richard looked up, meeting the boy's eyes, and for the first time, Lucas didn't look away. He came back twice. The second time, he told her. She wasn't leaving again. Richard didn't speak. His jaw clenched and he swallowed 1,000 things he wanted to say, threats, promises, rage. Instead, he reached into the drawer, pulled out a notepad, and wrote Rago's name again. Under it, he wrote, "We find her." He didn't show it to Lucas, he just left the notepad there. Lucas didn't touch it, but he saw it. His fingers grazed the edge. And that night, he sat closer to Richard than he had since arriving. Richard, who had once used this space to host tech moguls and billion-dollar deals, now stood in the middle of it with a pencil behind his ear and crime scene photos across the floor. The ghost of who he had been, the careful man, the distant man, was being erased with every new file opened, every call made in a whisper. Montgomery Tower, once a symbol of detachment, now pulsed with quiet purpose. The boy hadn't cried. Richard hadn't asked. But both had changed something in each other. When Claire called again near midnight to confirm a possible location tied to Rago's last known drop, Richard didn't wait to plan it alone. He motioned to Lucas, pointed to the chair beside him, and simply said, "Come see." The boy obeyed. No questions. No fear, just movement, small, brave, silent, the kind that says, "I'm still watching, still deciding." And as Richard drew a new line between names and places, with Lucas leaning in just close enough to see but not yet speak, the apartment shifted once more. Not into a war room, not into a home, but into something between the two. A space where the unspoken promise lingered. We will find her. The ride to East Oakland was quiet, but it wasn't silence, it was strategy simmering. Nathan drove the black SUV while Claire sat in the back with a laptop open, her eyes flicking between live feeds and thermal scans. Richard stared out the window, jaw tight, fists closed in his lap. None of them needed to say what this meant. Every mile they crossed brought them closer to the heartbeat of something raw, something too personal to name. The warehouse had come up in 3 different cross-referenced locations tied to Rago's shell businesses. It looked forgotten on satellite view. But ghosts didn't need windows. They needed walls and locked doors. As they neared, Nathan slowed, parking 2 blocks out. He opened the trunk and pulled out a slim black case. "Drone's ready," he muttered. Richard stepped forward. "You sure it's not going to tip them off?" Nathan gave him a sideways glance, its whisper silent. "No one's going to hear a damn thing." Richard nodded but didn't relax. Inside the car, Claire tapped into the feed. "All right," she said, voice steady. "We've got eyes in the sky in 30 seconds. See what kind of hell we're dealing with." The drone lifted, smooth and quiet, just like Nathan promised, cutting through the darkness and slipping into the alleyways like a silent witness. On the screen, grainy footage began to sharpen as Claire adjusted the contrast. "There," she said, pointing. 3 heat signatures near the north entrance. 5 more in the back. Smaller ones. Richard's throat tightened. Smaller. Women. Maybe even teenagers. Nathan cursed under his breath, adjusting the controls. "There's a main door with a broken hinge. I can get the drone inside, but I need another angle." Richard leaned in. "Try the south window, it's cracked. Might slip the cam through." Claire made the adjustment on her end. For a breathless moment, the screen flickered, and then, faces. Bruised. Blank. Eyes that didn't look at the camera but through it. And then Richard saw her. "Stop," he said. "Zoom in." Claire obeyed. The image sharpened. Marissa Carter. Hair matted, lips swollen, hands tied in front. But she was alive. Breathing. Richard exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "That's her," he whispered. "That's Lucas's mom." No one said a word, they didn't have to. The air shifted. The mission was no longer a maybe. It was now. Back at Montgomery Tower, Lucas sat in front of the same screen hours later, silent as ever. Richard had brought the laptop home without saying much, but when he opened the footage, the boy drifted into the room like a phantom, drawn by something heavier than curiosity. Richard let him watch without commentary. No explanation, no easing in, just the raw feed. When the frame landed on Marissa, Lucas's small hand reached out and touched the screen gently, as if afraid to break it. His eyes didn't blink, his lips didn't move. But his body, tense until that second, eased the way a rope slackens once it's no longer pulled. "That's her," Richard said softly. Lucas gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Richard could feel it in his bones. The boy's whole world had just shifted. Hope had been reborn, trembling but real. "She's alive," he said again, slower this time, almost like a vow. "We're gonna bring her back." Lucas didn't speak. He just stared and held on to that image like it was air in his lungs. They moved fast after that. Claire called in favors without ever mentioning the bureau. Nathan looped in a contact from a local shelter who had seen the vans used in past trafficking attempts. Richard coordinated entry routes like he was planning a hostile corporate takeover, and in a way he was. This wasn't business, but it was war. Every detail mattered, every second counted. When the plan was set, they entered just before dawn. Nathan cut the power remotely. Claire took point with a weapon drawn. Richard followed behind, unarmed but far from helpless. They breached through the service door and swept the halls like they'd done it 100 times, because in their old lives, they had. They found 7 women. No guards, no resistance. The place had been abandoned in a hurry. "They were tipped off," Claire hissed, helping untie a woman whose wrists were raw. Richard moved from face to face, searching, scanning, and there, in the last locked room, huddled on a mattress that had no right to be called a bed, Marissa Carter, alive, barely. "We've got her," he said into his voice shaking for the first time all night. We've got her." They didn't celebrate, there was no time. Claire and Nathan escorted the women out to the van while Richard stayed with Marissa, giving her water, watching her lips tremble not from fear but recognition. "Lucas," she whispered. "Is he safe?" Richard said, his voice steady now. "He's safe. He's waiting." Tears pooled in her eyes, but she nodded and gripped his hand tightly as if she needed to believe it physically. Then the sound came, tires skidding outside, a distant engine followed by nothing. "Go," Richard told Claire over the comm. Now, she knew. She didn't argue. They drove fast, disappearing into the city before whatever shadow had returned could do damage. Rago had vanished. Again, the warehouse was empty now. Evidence was secured, women rescued. But the man who orchestrated it all had slipped away like a curse lingering after prayer. Richard stood in the middle of that cold space, the echo of chains now broken filling the silence. He looked at the door Marissa had come through, then at the screen still burned in his memory. Lucas's eyes when he saw her. They had her back. But Vince Rago was still out there. And that meant the shadow would grow. Marissa's return didn't bring immediate peace, but it changed the rhythm of everything. The penthouse that once echoed with silence now carried the low hum of life returning in fragments. Lucas, still clinging to the wooden box like a life raft, began spending more time on the living room floor. At first he only sat there, legs crossed, his back against the couch while the others moved around him. Then quietly he began to draw. Not on paper, at least not right away, but directly on the marble floor with a washable marker Richard had left by accident on the table. Simple things at first, stick figures, crooked trees, clouds with uneven edges. Marissa noticed but said nothing. She just watched, her eyes soaking in the sight of her son doing something normal, something free. Richard, for his part, didn't stop him. He watched from his desk, noting how the boy's shoulders lowered with each stroke, how the tension in his little body seemed to lift even if just for a moment. The floor, once cold and untouchable, began to hold something meaningful, a child's voice in shapes and colors. Marissa had barely spoken for the first few days. Her body was safe, but her mind still lived inside the warehouse, in the chains, in the silence, in the dread. Ellen tried gently, offering soft clothes, homemade meals, warm baths. But it was Lucas who finally cracked her open. One morning as she passed through the kitchen on the way to the guest room, she paused by the table where Richard had left a new set of acrylic paints. They were untouched, sealed, pristine. Lucas looked up from his drawing, caught her gaze, and nudged the smallest canvas toward her without a word. She sat down, no ceremony, no grand moment, just a brush dipped into hesitant color. Her hands shook, but they moved. The first strokes were awkward, abstract lines with no intent, but with every motion, something in her thawed. Ellen peeked from the hallway and bit back tears. It wasn't art yet. It wasn't therapy, but it was a beginning. The kind of beginning that doesn't come from rescue operations or legal paperwork. It comes from being seen. And more than that, from being allowed to stay broken. Richard had never realized how much he'd relied on silence until it was interrupted. It used to be a kind of safety for him. The stillness of his apartment was a fortress after his wife's death. But now that same silence made him anxious. He found himself listening for signs of life, the scrape of Lucas's marker on the floor, the running water when Marissa washed brushes, Ellen's humming in the kitchen. The penthouse had never been designed for this. It was cold in its elegance, efficient in its luxury. But now it had jackets on chairs, a toy left under the couch, canvases leaning against the wall. Richard was no longer just protecting people, he was watching them live. And it terrified him more than any threat Rago had ever posed. Because this was fragile. Love wasn't something you locked away in a safe or shielded with security cameras. It breathed. It demanded presence. And presence meant being vulnerable to loss all over again. One night while walking past the living room, Richard saw Lucas fast asleep on the floor, the box tucked under his arm like a stuffed animal. Richard crouched beside him, adjusted the blanket Ellen had placed, and whispered, "I've got you." The boy didn't stir, but his grip on the box loosened just slightly. Ellen, too, had changed. For decades, she had kept her emotions under check. Efficient, loyal, precise. But this house had changed. She now cooked more than anyone could possibly eat, experimenting with new recipes she hadn't tried in years. She said it was just keeping busy, but everyone knew better. Her love came through the scent of garlic, the sight of warm cookies cooling on the marble counter. She insisted Lucas help her bake, and though he didn't speak much, he followed her with serious eyes, mimicking her gestures, pressing cookie dough into shapes. Sometimes he'd silently offer her a crooked star-shaped one, and she'd pretend it was a masterpiece. With Marissa, Ellen was more patient than she'd ever been with anyone. She never asked her to talk about what happened. Instead, she treated her as someone who belonged. No pity, no fear, just quiet acceptance. That, more than anything, helped Marissa start returning to herself. Richard saw all this and wondered when his home had stopped being his and started being theirs, and he was fine with it, maybe even grateful. The structure was the same, the walls, the floors, the ceilings, but now the house breathed, and so did he. Still, despite the new normal forming in small, beautiful pieces, fear lingered in the corners. Richard could feel it. The shadows hadn't left. Lucas still checked the locks before bed. Marissa jolted awake at sudden movements. And Richard himself found it hard to sleep for more than 3 hours without waking up to check the security feeds. Rago was still out there somewhere, and the threat of his return curled around them like a fog. But rather than let it crush them, it bound them together. One night, Richard found Marissa standing in the hallway with a blanket draped over her shoulders, staring at a painting she had started but never finished. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "It's strange," she said. "I know we're safe, but I still feel like I need to run." Richard nodded, understanding too well. "I used to think walls were enough," he replied. "Turns out safety isn't something you build, it's something you give." Over and over. She looked at him, eyes tired but grateful. "Thank you for not letting him go through this alone." Richard didn't respond with words. He simply stood beside her and they watched the unfinished canvas in silence, letting it be unfinished for now. Lucas still slept with the wooden box beside him every night. It remained his final line of defense, his anchor to a world that had once made sense. Richard noticed how the boy would check on it gently, reverently before lying down, ensuring it was never more than an arm's reach away. He never opened it in front of anyone. He never explained it. But Richard knew. It wasn't the object itself, but what it meant. A promise. A memory. A mother who had not been forgotten. So Richard didn't try to take it away. Didn't tell him it was safe now. Because safety wasn't about words. It was about consistency. Being there. Returning every morning and not disappearing overnight. That night, as Richard stood at the threshold of Lucas's room, watching him sleep soundly for the first time since the rescue, he understood something new. Protection wasn't about building higher walls. It was about becoming someone who stayed, who kept showing up. And in that quiet moment, the kind that doesn't need to be named, the house exhaled. Not with certainty, not with finality, but with a fragile, precious truth. They were still afraid. But they were together. And that was enough, for now. The call came in a little after noon. Claire had been tracking chatter across the bay, but this wasn't just noise. This was deliberate. Vince Rago was back in San Francisco, not rumored, not suggested, verified. Nathan had traced a burner phone ping to a location 3 blocks from a middle school. Rago didn't hide in shadows anymore. He walked streets with fake credentials and new IDs, but the same hunger burned behind his eyes. His methods hadn't changed either. Within hours, printed posters began appearing across certain districts, telephone poles, storefronts, even inside a laundromat near Civic Center. At first glance, they seemed innocent. A smiling face of a child, a desperate headline, a contact number. But to the trained eye, and certainly to Richard's, it was bait. The photo wasn't Lucas, but the resemblance was intentional, the manipulation cold. The message beneath was clearer than words. "I know he's here." Richard stood in his office holding one of the posters Ellen had torn down on her way home. He stared at it for a long time, then folded it once deliberately and placed it in his drawer. The threat wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a strategy, and a deadline. Marissa was the first to bring up the Federal Protection Program. Claire had floated it days earlier as a contingency, but now it sat on the dining table like a loaded weapon. "They can move us tonight," she said, her voice measured but tight. "New names, new city, new lives." Richard listened, arms crossed, but he didn't speak. Lucas stood in the hallway, just close enough to hear but not be seen. Marissa continued, eyes on her son. He'd be safe. We'd be ghosts, untouchable. Ellen, standing in the corner with a dish towel in her hands, finally said what no one else wanted: "You to disappear." The silence that followed was deafening. Marissa nodded. "Maybe that's what we have to be." Richard finally moved, walking toward the table and placing a folder down inside. Evidence gathered by Nathan, photos, names, links to Rago's past operations. Or, Richard said quietly, "We make him disappear." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't anger. It was resolve. Everyone in the room felt it. Marissa's hands trembled, but she didn't argue. Claire on speaker let out a slow breath. "If you're staying," she said, "we do this my way. No hero moves, no lone wolves. We lock this down tight." Richard didn't flinch. "Deal." Later that night, Lucas found Richard alone in the living room, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee untouched in his hand. The boy walked in silently, clutching a small pillow not for comfort but for courage. Richard looked over, gave a nod, and set the cup down. Lucas stood for a long moment before walking over and sitting beside him. No words passed at first. The city stretched below them, a grid of lights and invisible dangers. "He's looking for me," Lucas said, not as a question but as fact. Richard didn't correct him. Lucas looked up. "You said I was safe." Richard met his gaze. "You are?" "I promise." There was a pause, one that carried every ounce of fear Lucas had tried to keep buried. "If I call you," the boy said, voice barely above a whisper, "will you come back?" Richard's breath caught. The question was raw, vulnerable. Not just about Rago, not just about danger. It was about abandonment. About all the people who had said they'd stay and didn't. Richard didn't answer right away. He turned fully to face Lucas, lowered himself so their eyes met level, and gave a firm, steady nod. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate, a pact. Marissa watched the exchange from down the hallway, unseen, her hand pressed lightly against the wall for balance. She didn't intrude, didn't need to. That moment belonged to them, a man slowly remembering how to show up, and a boy learning what trust looked like when it wasn't broken. She turned away, blinking back tears she hadn't expected. Later, when Richard passed her in the hallway, she stopped him. "You didn't have to promise that," she said quietly. Richard paused. "Yes, I did." She didn't argue. "And if he calls?" she asked. He looked at her without hesitation. "Then I come back." There was nothing left to say after that. The truth didn't need reinforcing. The apartment had changed in ways they hadn't anticipated, not just in sounds and routines, but in weight. Every word now carried more. Every silence had history behind it. The presence of danger sharpened everything, but it also clarified what mattered. Not safety, not even survival, but loyalty. That was the anchor, the thing you could hold on to when everything else threatened to pull you under. Nathan worked tirelessly from a secure location nearby, tracing digital footprints, surveillance gaps, and cross-referencing sightings. Claire expanded security around the building. New systems, tighter perimeters. Ellen changed the locks herself, swearing under her breath about how she should have done it sooner. Everyone played their part, but still, Richard's nights got shorter. He slept less, watched more, not from fear, but from readiness. He began reading Rago's patterns like a second language. Not out of obsession, but duty. He couldn't afford the luxury of peace, not yet. Lucas had begun sleeping better, even smiling sometimes. Marissa painted every morning now, always something abstract, but with colors growing bolder. That was what made the decision hard. The knowledge that life was finally creeping back in, and that it could be ripped away at any second. Richard stood at the window again that evening, the city sprawling below, thinking not about Rago, but about a small voice asking him the only question that mattered. "Will you come back?" That wasn't just about one night. That was a promise that had to be renewed every day. In action, not in words. It was a vow. And when Lucas asked it quietly, bravely, under the shadow of fear, Richard didn't answer with a speech or with false assurance. He answered with something far stronger, a steady nod, one that meant yes, one that meant always. The security system didn't beep. It didn't flash red or scream an alert. That was the first sign something was wrong. Richard noticed the faint click of the front door unlocking. But by the time he reached the hallway, the door was already ajar. No forced entry, no shattered lock. Rago had used a cloned keycard. Claire had warned him this was possible, but neither of them expected it would happen so soon. Richard barely had time to react before the man stepped through the threshold, taller than he remembered, colder than he imagined. Vince Rago's eyes swept the apartment like he owned it, like he had every right to take back what he believed was his. Marissa froze for half a second before grabbing Lucas and running toward the back hallway. "Closet!" Richard shouted, voice sharp with urgency. Marissa didn't hesitate. She vanished into the guest suite, locking herself and Lucas inside the walk-in closet. Richard turned back just as Rago advanced. "Where's the boy?" Rago growled. Richard didn't answer, didn't blink. His hands moved instinctively to the coat rack, fingers curling around the polished wooden bat he kept for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The fight wasn't cinematic, it was chaos. Rago lunged first, knocking over a lamp as he closed the distance between them. Richard swung the bat, catching him across the shoulder, but it barely slowed him down. The man was strong, built like a machine, and desperate. Desperation made people reckless, but it also made them dangerous. Richard was no fighter. He'd spent the last decade behind desks and digital walls, not brawling in his living room with a criminal who had nothing left to lose. They crashed into furniture, glass shattering underfoot. Richard took a punch to the ribs, then another to the jaw, but he didn't fall. He couldn't. Every hit he took felt like a shield thrown over the closet door where Marissa and Lucas were hiding. Every second he stayed on his feet was another second they were safe. Rago slammed him into the wall, hand tightening around Richard's throat. "You think you can protect them?" he hissed. Richard choked out a laugh, blood trickling from his lip. "You already lost," he said, hoarse but defiant. That was when Rago raised a knife, not for intimidation, but for closure. At that moment, the closet door cracked open just an inch, and Marissa saw it. The knife. The angle. Richard's fading strength. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She picked up a heavy iron candlestick from the dresser and stepped out quietly, barefoot, heart hammering. "Hey!" she shouted. Rago turned, just a fraction. Richard used that second to shove forward, slamming Rago against the wall. The knife clattered across the floor. But the distraction turned into a threat. Rago's eyes shifted instantly to Marissa, recognizing her, the only loose end he hadn't tied. He moved fast. Too fast, Richard shouted her name, but it all happened in a blur. Rago was mid-step, arm raised to strike, when Claire Monroe burst through the front door like a thunderclap. "Down," she yelled. The gunshot was sharp, surgical, one shot, no warning. It hit Rago clean through the chest. He staggered, stunned, then collapsed. Richard's breathing came in ragged gasps. Marissa stood frozen, the candlestick slipping from her hand. And in the sudden silence, Claire lowered her weapon, her eyes scanning the room for confirmation. "It's over," she said, not to anyone in particular, but it was true. There was no rush to the phone, no dramatic music, just the sound of a monster falling and the terrifying quiet that followed. Marissa dropped to her knees beside Richard, helping him sit up, her fingers trembling as she touched the bruise on his cheek. He winced, then managed a strained smile. "You okay?" she whispered. He nodded. "Lucas?" "Safe." She didn't need to say more. In the hallway, Ellen appeared, pale and shaken, her hands covering her mouth. Claire stepped forward and gently pushed her back. "Secure the perimeter. I've got this." Claire checked Rago's pulse once. Nothing. She stood and made the call, not to her superiors, but to Nathan. "Target neutralized." "Repeat, neutralized." Then she knelt beside Richard, squeezing his shoulder. "Told you no hero moves." Richard gave a half laugh, half cough. "Didn't exactly plan it this way." Marissa looked between them, tears welling but unshed. Her gaze shifted to the closet. "He heard it," she whispered. Claire followed her eyes. "He needs you." And with that, Marissa rose, walked slowly to the guest room, and opened the closet door. Lucas sat curled in the corner, arms wrapped around his knees, the wooden box clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. His face was dry, no tears yet, just silence. Marissa knelt beside him, not touching, just breathing in his space. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, voice cracking. "It's over. He's gone. You're safe." Lucas didn't respond at first. Then his chin quivered, one blink and the dam broke. The sob wasn't loud, it wasn't panicked, but it was deep, pulled from the gut of everything he'd held in for weeks. He buried his face in her shoulder, and Marissa held him like she hadn't since before everything went wrong. Richard stood by the doorway now, watching. Not intruding. Not interrupting. The boy he'd found in the rain was finally releasing the weight he'd carried in silence, not because he was scared, but because he didn't have to be anymore. That difference mattered. It made Richard's knees weak in a way no fight ever had. Behind him, Claire quietly radioed for a cleanup team. There would be questions, reports, headlines, but none of that mattered right now. Because in that closet, in the arms of his mother, for the first time since it all began, Lucas cried not from fear, but from relief. The morning sun didn't rise with fanfare, but it touched everything it needed to. In the rooftop garden of Richard Miles' penthouse, tucked among carefully pruned fig trees and a patch of herbs Lucas had helped plant with uneven hands, stood a table. Around it were no reporters, no cameras, just people, the kind that mattered. Marissa held a warm mug of tea with both hands, eyes drifting off into her son, who was kneeling beside a row of lavender, checking on a sprout like it was a treasure. Richard stood beside her, quieter than usual, but not distant. Today he had something to say, something he had been rehearsing in silence for weeks. He cleared his throat. Lucas looked up. "I want to talk to both of you," Richard said, voice steady but laced with something fragile underneath. Marissa straightened. Lucas came closer, cautious but curious. "I've been thinking a lot about what family means," Richard continued, "and how sometimes the people we choose become stronger than the ones we're born into." He crouched to meet Lucas's eyes. "I'd like to adopt you. Not to take anything from you, not your mom, not your past, just to make sure you never feel alone again." Lucas didn't answer right away. He just stared at Richard with that piercing gaze of his, the one that always seemed older than his years. Marissa held her breath, unsure whether to step in or stay quiet. Finally, Lucas looked down at his shoes, then up again. "Will I still be Lucas Carter?" he asked, voice small but serious. Richard nodded. "You'll always be Lucas Carter. That name is yours, and so is your story. But if you want, we can add miles to it. Not to replace anything, just to show we belong to each other." The boy seemed to consider that for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Can I write it sometimes, Lucas Carter Miles?" Richard smiled, and something in his chest that had been frozen for years gave way. "You can write it however you want," he said. "It's your name. Your choice." Marissa wiped at her eyes and looked up at the sky as if grounding herself against the wave of emotion that was threatening to rise. Lucas nodded. That was all. Just a nod, but it was more than permission. It was trust. It was a beginning. Later that afternoon, Marissa found herself walking past the office they had turned into a makeshift planning center during the search for her. The whiteboard was still there, names half erased, old addresses crossed out. She picked up a marker without thinking and erased the last bit of writing. Target, Rago. In its place. She wrote in soft cursive, Second Light. It was more than the name of a nonprofit. It was a belief that no matter how dark the night, there could be another chance. That week, with Claire's help, she filed the paperwork. A month later, the organization opened its doors in a borrowed space downtown, offering counseling, housing, and legal support to mothers like her and children like Lucas. It wasn't easy. There were tears, stories she wasn't always ready to hear, and moments when her own trauma reared its head. But every time she felt overwhelmed, she remembered that night, the closet, Lucas's trembling body, Richard's bloodied hands, and reminded herself why she was still standing. She had survived, and survival demanded purpose. Back at the penthouse, Richard's world was changing in smaller, quieter ways. He no longer kept the guest room closed. Lucas had picked a wall color, a chaotic shade of green that somehow made sense. The boy's drawings now covered the fridge, the side of the kitchen island, and even the back of Richard's leather notebook. "You're not very organized," Lucas had said once, watching him scribble business notes in the middle of a page filled with dinosaurs. "I'm adapting," Richard replied dryly, but he hadn't erased the dinosaurs. Ellen now cooked meals big enough for 3 and sometimes 4 when Claire stopped by. Richard didn't flee meetings anymore. He stayed. He asked questions. He even called Nathan just to talk, which was a surprise to both of them. It wasn't about becoming someone new, it was about remembering who he might have been if the world hadn't broken him. And in this new version of his life, being called Dad wasn't something he expected. But one night, Lucas mumbled it half asleep, and Richard didn't correct him. He just sat beside the bed a little longer, hand resting near the wooden box Lucas still kept nearby. The adoption process wasn't complicated. Richard's name alone carried enough weight to push things through quickly, but he insisted on doing it the right way. Social worker visits, psychological evaluations, official interviews. "Lucas deserves for this to be real," he said when the attorney suggested skipping a few steps. Marissa agreed. So when the final court date was set, they didn't invite anyone. No press, no attention. Just the 3 of them. But before the legal ceremony, Richard chose to say it out loud, not in a courtroom, but in the only place that mattered, the rooftop garden. Lucas had watered the plants that morning. His hands were still dirty with soil when he sat on the bench. Richard knelt beside him and placed a document on the table. "This says, I want to be your dad, officially," he said. But this, he tapped his chest, already decided that a long time ago. Lucas didn't read the paper. He just took the pen and scribbled his name beneath Richard's. No hesitation. Then he looked up and said, "Now it's on paper. So it's forever, right?" Richard nodded, eyes burning. "Yeah, kid, forever." So the announcement wasn't grand. There was no music, no audience. Just wind through the rooftop herbs and the sound of a pen scratching a new name across a page. But in that garden, among plants Lucas had helped revive, Richard Miles announced the most important decision of his life: to adopt Lucas, not to own him, but to make sure he would never feel alone again. The courtroom wasn't as grand as Lucas had imagined. It was quieter, less like the movies. The walls were pale and the ceiling lights hummed softly overhead, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the weight of the suit jacket on his small shoulders, the way his shoes pinched at the toes, and the familiar, now empty wooden box cradled in his lap. He had insisted on bringing it, not because he needed to clutch it for comfort anymore, but because it had walked every step of this journey with him. Richard sat to his right, stiff in a navy suit, his fingers tapping once against his knee before stopping. Marissa, glowing but nervous, offered Lucas a reassuring nod from the front row. When the judge, a silver-haired woman with soft eyes, leaned slightly forward and asked, "Lucas, do you understand what it means to be adopted?" The room fell into a hush. The boy swallowed, adjusted his grip on the box, and looked up, not at the judge, but at Richard. "Yes, Your Honor," he said clearly. Then, after a pause that felt like the wait of a lifetime, he added, "Because he came back. He always came back." The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like something holy. Even the court clerk seemed to blink slower, as if afraid to disturb what had just been spoken. Marissa pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes glistening. Richard looked straight ahead, his jaw tightening just slightly, not in resistance but in surrender to something real. The judge tilted her head, then offered a gentle smile. "Well," she said softly, "that's as good a reason as any I've ever heard." She reached for the gavel, glanced at the paperwork one last time, and struck it once with firm finality. "The petition for adoption is granted. From this day forward, Lucas Carter shall be known as Lucas Miles." The sound of the gavel echoed far beyond the wood. It echoed into the bones of everyone present. It was not just a legal decision, it was the sealing of a promise. Lucas didn't cheer, didn't cry. He just looked again at Richard, and for the first time, he allowed himself to lean against him, not because he needed protection, but because he belonged. In the car ride home, the weight of the moment softened into something lighter. Lucas loosened his tie and finally kicked off the tight shoes. Richard glanced at him from the driver's seat, then said, "You did good in there." Lucas shrugged, a little smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You think I looked like someone who knew what he was doing?" "He looked like someone who knew what he wanted," Richard replied. They drove in easy silence for a few blocks before Richard added almost offhandedly, "I was thinking, pancakes. Every Saturday? Deal?" Lucas turned toward him, his eyes lighting up. "With chocolate chips?" "Obviously," Richard said, mock offended. "And strawberries, too. Maybe even whipped cream." Lucas chuckled, that rare, unguarded laugh that now came more freely. "You're gonna spoil me?" "That's the plan," Richard said, reaching over briefly to ruffle his hair before returning his hand to the wheel. Marissa, sitting in the back seat, caught Lucas's reflection in the rearview mirror, the kind of smile a mother memorizes for the days when storms return. For now, there were no storms, only blue skies between their words. Back in the penthouse, things felt different, but not in a grand, sweeping way. It was in the smallest details. The door didn't just open, it welcomed. The rooms didn't just echo, they hummed. Ellen met them at the entrance with a hug for Lucas and a tray of celebratory cupcakes topped with way too many sprinkles. "Judge said you're officially one of us now," she told him, handing over a cupcake as if it were a medal of honor. Lucas took a bite, frosting smearing his upper lip, and declared, "Best legal decision ever." Richard rolled his eyes playfully, already reaching for one of his own. The rest of the evening passed in a slow, satisfying rhythm, laughter over dinner, stories about names and how they shape people. Lucas making a new label for his art box that read, "Property of L.M. Richard," didn't correct him, he just helped spell it. And later, long after the sun had dipped behind the skyline, Lucas padded into the living room and carefully placed the wooden box on a shelf. Not hidden, not buried, just placed, beside something new. That something new was a photo. It had been taken just 2 days earlier on the rooftop garden. In it, 3 figures stood together. Lucas in the middle, Marissa with one hand on his shoulder, Richard with the other. No one was posing. No one was told to smile, but they did, all the same. The kind of smiles that didn't need a camera to be remembered. Richard had framed the picture and set it next to the box without a word. When Lucas saw it there, he paused for a long second. "Looks like we made it," he murmured, almost to himself. Richard, passing by behind him, placed a hand on the boy's back and squeezed gently. "We didn't just make it," he said. "We started something new." Lucas nodded, and they didn't need to say more. They both knew. The photo stayed where it was, and so did the box. Neither needed to be touched again. Not because the past didn't matter, but because it had finally found a place to rest. And so the day ended exactly as it had begun, in quiet ceremonies surrounded by love that had been earned, not given. The court might have called it an adoption, but those who were there knew better. It was a reunion of hearts that hadn't known they were waiting for each other. Richard, once a man drowning in silence, now lived in a home filled with laughter and stories and chocolate chip pancakes every Saturday. Marissa, once broken by the world's cruelty, now gave light to others who'd been lost. And Lucas, once a boy running barefoot through the rain, now walked tall with a name that was never meant to be borrowed but claimed. On a shelf in a warm apartment, an old wooden box rested beside a photo. One was a symbol of survival, the other of belonging. Together, they told the story of Lucas Miles, a boy who was found, chosen, and finally home. What part of the story touched your heart the most? We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Here on Stories That Stay, each video is crafted with care, sometimes taking over a week to complete, all with you in mind. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, heal, and connect. And if you haven't yet, feel free to explore our other videos. Each one holds something special. Thank you for being here with us today. We're truly grateful, and we'll see you in the next story.